Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome, everyone, to this week's session of Law and Science. I am Marilyn Haj, a study candidate at UVA School of Law. I will serve as your moderator for this session. Before turning to today's esteemed speaker, Kimberly Krawiec, let me briefly introduce the Law and Science Project. Law and Science is an academic initiative coordinated by a group of JSD candidates from across the United States who share the same belief in legal methodologies. Legal methodologies are often understood as a discipline distinct from sciences, traditionally consisting of doctrinal analysis and normative questions. Through this series of interdisciplinary talks, we aim to show that legal research can be improved and benefit from scientific methodologies that provide systemic ways to approach questions. If you want to learn more about our project, please visit our website and join our email list. One of our awesome coordinators will drop the links in the chat. Speaking of our coordinators, I would like to take a moment to introduce the team. We have Simon Sun, who is the co-founder of this initiative and an assistant professor at National Yangming Chao Tung University School of Law. We've got Stuti Shah, who's a JSD candidate at Columbia, and Sung Chun Chen, who's another JSD candidate at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign School of Law. We've also got Vanessa Villanueva, who's a senior fellow at Law and Science. And we also have representatives from diverse law schools in the US, such as UC Berkeley, UPenn, University of Illinois, University of Washington, Columbia, and Fordham. And if you're interested in getting involved, we are always looking for new law science representatives. We also host a blog on legal methodology called the Legal Method Lab, and we're always on the lookout for new editors. So if you're interested in becoming either a representative or an editor, please reach out to us. Finally, I want to give a shout out to the Legal Research Forum at UVA Law, headed by Geronimo Alberdi. Thank you, Geronimo. I see some familiar faces from the school, so thank you for making sure that they join us today. But enough with the shameless marketing. Let's turn to today's esteemed speaker. Kim Krawiec's current research analyzes taboo trades, which means exchanges that are contested by society and in some cases forbidden altogether. She has written on commercial surrogacy, egg and sperm markets, and sex work. At the moment, much of her work is on incentives for organ donation. Although financial incentives are part of the menu, she's most interested in non-financial incentives, such as kidney swaps and EAD chains, and priority systems that provide an incentive to donate. Krawiec hosts a podcast called Taboo Trades. We urge you to tune in. Another area of her research centers on the regulation of financial markets and business organization. Professor Krawiec has extensively examined the administrative process surrounding the Volcker Rule, a complex and highly contested provision of the Dodd-Frank Act. She has also researched corporate boards of directors. Through an ethnographic method, this work analyzes directors' views on the workings of the corporate boardroom and board relations with management, with a special emphasis on directors' views on race and gender diversity in the boardroom. Prior to joining academia, Professor Krawiec was a member of the Commodity and Derivatives Group at the New York office of Sullivan and Cromwell. She has served as a commentator for the Central European and Eurasian Law Initiative of the American Bar Association and on the faculty of the National Association for Securities Dealers Institute for Professional Development at the Wharton School of Business. She earned her Juris Doctorate from Georgetown and a bachelor's degree from North Carolina State University. Professor Krawiec has also taught law at Duke Law School, the University of North Carolina, Harvard, and Northwestern, where she received the 1999-2000 Robert Childress Award for Teaching Excellence. Professor Krawiec's presentation, entitled The Moral Complexities of Kidney Donation, explores the ethics and practicalities surrounding kidney donation, a topic that is highly relevant to the law science community. By examining the moral dilemmas and policy consideration about this complex issue, Professor Krawiec's talk will shed light on the interplay between law, science, and human welfare. This aligns perfectly with law science's goal of fostering interdisciplinary dialogue to advance our understanding of how the legal system can be reformed to better serve the public interest. Her insights will undoubtedly contribute to our ongoing efforts to bridge the gap between academia and real-world impact. This is why this talk today is the very last talk in our new series called Law in Action. On a very final note, We will have a Q&A segment at the end of this session, so please stay till the end, prepare some questions. We look forward to a tantalizing conversation with you. But now, without further ado, Professor Krawiec, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'll be talking to you today about a paper that is co-authored with Al Roth, the economist, critiquing the WHO principles on organs and blood. I think it's an appropriate topic for this particular group because, in effect, just following up on Marilyn's introduction about your goals in terms of not thinking of law as being separate from science. This is our argument, is that the international community and WHO's guidance in particular needs to follow the science, which they have not done. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why that is. I think some of our cases are easy and some of them are very difficult, but nonetheless, the current approach is wrong in our opinion. So let me just talk a little bit about these twin principles of the World Health Organization. They are first non-remuneration and second self-sufficiency. Okay, I'm trying to bring you guys back up here. You've disappeared once again. Let me try. No.
Try the view button again on the top.
View. Oh, okay, got it. All right, let me close this or reduce this. Okay, I can at least see some of you now. Okay, great. So these twin principles are non-remuneration and self-sufficiency. Non-remuneration meaning that there should be no payment/compensation. We'll talk about this definition in a minute because it has different meanings across different jurisdictions. And self-sufficiency, that countries and sometimes only regions within countries should be self-sufficient when it comes to the blood and organ supply. So our argument, these twin principles are codified in various laws around the world in different forms. I'll talk a little bit about what they are. WHO is not itself a legal rulemaking body, but it is influential in its proposals and recommendations, and as we're going to argue, gives some countries cover because of the ethical rules that they've adopted. These rules are problematic separately for reasons I'm going to talk about, and they're unworkable together, especially in the case of plasma, as I'm going to show you. So I'm going to start with what I think. I'm going to go from the clearest cases to the more difficult cases, starting with blood products and in particular plasma. First, I'll talk about plasma and then I will talk about whole blood. And then after that, I'll talk about organs with the focus on kidneys, which is sort of where most of the attention, most of the action is, and where most of the people who are waiting for transplantable organs are to be found. So, first of all, just to talk a little bit about what plasma is, it is the liquid portion of blood that carries the red and white cells, platelets, and vital proteins. Although there are a variety of uses for plasma, by far the biggest use is in plasma derivatives, PDMPs. These plasma-derived medicinal products. These are life-saving treatments for which there are no substitutes. They're used for a variety of illnesses, especially, but not only in children, and they're classified as essential drugs by the World Health Organization. These medicines are also unavailable to much of the world's population because of their scarcity and their expense. So the first thing to know is that there is no country in the world that fails to pay donors that is also self-sufficient in plasma. That is the reason that the United States, which pays plasma donors, provides over 70% of the world's plasma. And again, it does that by paying donors. So just to show you this chart, I think these numbers are from so it varies. Some of the most recent ones are 2020, but for some of these countries, the numbers are older. This is sort of within Europe, plasma self-reliance and models of plasma collection. And as you can see here, the only countries that are self-sufficient in plasma are the countries that also provide monetary payments to donors. That would be Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Latvia. No other country is. And that is despite offering other types of incentives, such as the most common being a paid leave of absence for work or something like that. Even that is insufficient in these countries, right? So the result, again, is that the US provides about 70% of the world's plasma supply, and these remaining countries are making up most of the rest. These charts, by the way, are from 2024, a paper by Julio Elias and others, a variety of co-authors. So how do the twin principles exacerbate this plasma shortage? I mean, the first and most obvious problem is that wealthy countries that don't pay donors, which are many countries, they cite the non-remuneration principle, right? They say that they are being ethical, but they are failing to add to the global supply. They're not failing to take away from the global supply because they are purchasing from the United States. As a result, they're reducing the supply that is available to low and middle income countries and driving up the price. And as a result, making plasma much more difficult for low and middle income countries to afford and access. Now, in part, this is because it is cheaper to just buy from the United States than to collect plasma domestically from unpaid donors. The most obvious example of this is Australia, where they found that the domestic supply of immunoglobulin costs over 3 times more per unit than what is imported, despite domestic donors not being compensated. And the reason for that is that you have a lot of fixed costs associated with plasma collection, and paid donors are more regular. They donate more frequently. They donate larger amounts. Those fixed costs don't change when you've got sort of unpaid donors who come haphazardly only once in a while and don't provide as much plasma, right? So the result is that really for economic reasons, wealthy countries are importing from the United States rather than contributing to the global supply as they could be, right? It goes without saying that poor countries are not going to be able to collect plasma, have fractionation facilities, and create plasma-derived products, right? But wealthy countries can and should be doing that rather than sticking to this non-remuneration principle. So what is our recommendation? To us, we think this is just the very clearest case, which is that rather than self-sufficiency and non-remuneration, what the international community, including WHO, should be doing is encouraging donor pay by wealthy countries and trade to low and middle income countries. They should be encouraging the use of foreign aid by low and middle income countries to purchase paid plasma. And there are no safety concerns here. Paid plasma is just as safe as plasma that is collected and derived from unpaid donors. And wealthy countries know this, even if they don't pay their own donors. If they didn't think this, they would not have been importing it from the United States for many decades now, right? So I just want to emphasize that it is not a safety consideration, with the possible exception of in the UK, which we can talk about. But otherwise, it's really not a safety concern that is driving this. It is really just that it is convenient, cheaper, and easier to import from the United States, and while also claiming to follow WHO and international policies about non-remuneration. Okay, next I want to talk about whole blood. Whole blood is used to treat patients who need it's used for a variety of purposes, but most prominently used to treat patients who need all of the components of blood, such as those who have sustained significant blood loss due to trauma or surgery. So according to WHO statistics, 79 countries collect over 90% of their whole blood supply from what are referred to as VNRBDs. That stands for voluntary non-remunerated blood donors who are not paid, right? And there is no country, I think, that kind of officially pays blood donors. Instead, the other countries in the WHO sample collect over 50% of their blood collection from replacement donors, family donors, paid donors. Many of you may be in countries that have this particular system. Even many relatively wealthy countries continue to have this type of system. The US used to have this type of system, but doesn't anymore. The problem here is that it is quite common in regimes that use family or replacement donors to have donors pose as friends or family members, leading to black markets, right? It's very difficult to detect who is really a friend or family member, who's being compensated, not to mention fairness issues. Not everybody has a friend or family member that sort of has a blood type that is in need or that is available to contribute right now, right? So a variety of problems and so everybody agrees that replacement family paid donors, that's not the way to go. What WHO encourages is the use of voluntary non-remunerated blood donors. Now, here there is a big divide between wealthy countries and low and middle income countries. For the most part, wealthy countries experience, for the most part, only seasonal shortages. Sometimes shortages in specific components, such as platelets, for example, which are harder to collect, don't last as long. But for the most part, what we're talking about are seasonal shortages in wealthy countries. So wealthy countries, right, admittedly, do pretty well on the altruistic system using voluntary non-remunerated donors, and don't really need to pay donors, although I will talk about the ways in which we do incentivize blood donation. Low and middle income countries, though, are in a completely different situation. First of all, I should say that the blood needs tend to be much higher in some of those countries, right? So for example, in many parts of Africa, some parts of Asia, there are higher rates of maternal death. There are higher rates of childhood anemia. There are more traffic accidents. There's more need for blood. In some of, but not all of those countries and regions, there are also higher rates of bloodborne illnesses, right? So making blood collection itself more difficult. But the result is just that many low and middle income countries cannot satisfy their blood needs through voluntary non-remunerated blood donors. And the result are shortages for transfusion, which contribute to maternal death, to death from traffic accidents, and from complications from childhood anemia. So here we also have recommendations. They are more cautious than our recommendations for plasma. And the reason for that is that the safety concern is more important when it comes to whole blood. Whole blood undergoes less processing than plasma. And as a result, we do have to be more concerned about the safety of the blood supply, and about not incentivizing people who may have bloodborne illnesses to contribute, right? So safety is paramount, and we are more cautious here. But we do think it is important to rely on the latest research rather than decades-old assumptions, as WHO is doing and many countries are doing. So early in debates about blood and about the effects of compensation on blood supply and blood safety. Many of you have probably heard of the research of somebody like Richard Titmus. This is not only old research, but it was never methodologically sound, even at the time it was collected. More rigorous, recent field-based research finds that is limited to small financial incentives, such as a, say, $15 gift card, finds that when done properly, and financial incentives do increase the supply, they increase it safely, and they increase it cost effectively. It does not result in any more blood contamination or having to discard any more blood than the current altruistic system. And importantly, I should say that many wealthy countries, including the United States, already do this, right? I mean, we already frequently give gift cards. Many countries also give, again, days off of work, compensation in the form of gift cards or movie tickets or something along that line, right? So we think that there are ways to incentivize blood donation, but most importantly, we just need to have a conversation using the most recent research, not relying on decades-old outmoded research and understandings and assumptions. Okay, that brings me to organs, which is, I think, by far the most difficult of the areas here. And we do have definitely some recommendations. They are more tentative, but I will tell you what they are, and I will tell you what we foresee the problems to be. And here we are focused a lot on the self-sufficiency directive, which we think is a terrible idea. Instead of leaning towards self-sufficiency, we should absolutely be leaning towards international cooperation for a variety of reasons. Um, so, why is that? Because modern innovations such as kidney matching and kidney exchange depend on a large pool of potential donors. All countries can benefit from international cooperation, including large countries with well-running, robust systems like the United States, Canada, much of Europe. But this is especially the case for smaller countries and countries without a robust kidney exchange program. Those are the countries that need our help, and that we should be working with rather than saying that they should learn to be self-sufficient. That is the wrong approach. So let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, I'm going to use the example of Denmark, a wealthy country with a well-developed transplant program and exchange, but a small country, right? So these bar charts I recognize are not that helpful because the disparity is so great that, you're just looking at one giant bar and one small bar, but I couldn't figure out any other way to do it. And I thought just putting numbers up was boring. So I kept it. But I'll go through each one. I mean, first of all, the population comparison, right? I mean, the US population is approximately 50 times larger than Denmark's. Here is the US at approximately 300 million and Denmark over here at 6 million. So first of all, the big population difference. That translates into a big difference in, for example, the number of deceased donors, as well as living donors, but I'm focusing here on just the number of deceased donors to keep things simple. The US had 12,000, I think this is from 2020, the US had 12,588 deceased donors, 100 times Denmark's 124 donors. And then finally, both countries perform transplants from both living and deceased donors. But as you would expect, given these population and donor disparities, the scale of operations in the US is just so significantly higher, right? So Denmark had 200 deceased donor transplants in 2020 and 78 living donor transplants. The United States had 18,410 deceased donor transplants and 5,234 living donor transplants. So a big disparity. So what does that mean? A difficult to match patient, and I'm focused here especially on difficult to match patients. So there are benefits even to easier to match patients, but the real benefits come from difficult to match patients, people who are highly sensitized to the genetic material, right, the biological material of large parts of the population. For people like this, you need big pools of potential donors in order to find a match. So a difficult to match patient, right, given these numbers, has a 100 times greater chance of finding a match in the US deceased donor pool than in the Danish donor pool, right? Now, the immediate response from people who want self-sufficiency rather than international cooperation is, okay, but now you're taking organs away from Americans who are giving them, right? How is that fair? We're donating organs for each other, not for outsiders. This isn't fair. Well, there might have been a time when there was, I mean, that particular argument might have held some sway at the time before kidney exchange, including kidney exchange using deceased donors, was a possibility. But now it is, right? Now we can easily turn this into a win-win situation. So for example, a hard to match pair from Denmark could travel to the United States. The recipient, the patient, could receive a compatible deceased donor kidney. The intended donor could start a chain of donors, a chain of donations by donating into the U.S. kidney exchange pool. And the result would be that a U.S. deceased donor kidney would be replaced by a better quality living donor kidney. Everybody wins here. So let me just back up a little bit and tell you what I mean by kidney exchange and kidney chains. I'm going to show you some examples in just a minute. But kidney exchange is essentially a barter system, right? Let's assume that, say, I'm willing to donate a kidney to my sister, but we're biologically incompatible, right? There's another pair somewhere else, right, who's in the same dilemma. They have somebody, a friend or family member who's willing to donate, but who is incompatible. In the simplest example, right, if I'm compatible with the patient from that other pair and that donor over there is compatible with my sister, then we can just engage in a swap in which I donate to that stranger donates to my sister, and everybody's happy and better off, right? Because that's hard to do. I mean, and that happens, right? But then you need perfect reciprocal matching, right? Each donor has to match each recipient, and the other pair's donor has to match this recipient. If you do a chain, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute, then that constraint is alleviated, right? You'll still have to match within, but now you can have, if you have, say, 30 pairs, right, as part of this chain, you can have a matching algorithm that sort of optimizes across all these different people. You can start a chain in which each person pays it forward. And at the end, you donate to the last person on the waiting list. So everybody is made better off. Nobody's made worse off in this. People from smaller countries or countries with less developed systems are helped. And people in a wealthy, developed country like the United States that has lots of difficult to match pairs for a variety of reasons that we can talk about is benefited as well, right? Everybody wins in this scenario. I will show you. So there are a variety of examples of this. It's not that there's never any international exchange. It's that it's not systematized. It's almost always a one-off, and it's almost always using the most difficult to match patients, right? And using only your most difficult to match patients is a difficult way of operating a transplant system, either domestically or internationally, because you're only dealing with the most difficult people, right? So if you have, as we have now, where everybody does their easiest matches domestically and only goes internationally when they have something that's really difficult, then by definition, you're going to have very little international cooperation, and people are going to languish on the waiting list for a long time, which is exactly what we see happening. So this is an example from 2021. There was a three-way exchange between the UAE and Israel. As you might imagine, the politics of this and the diplomacy involved were quite difficult here, but nonetheless, it happened. And it happened because of some specific compatibilities, right? So the UAE overall has excellent hospitals, performs kidney exchange, provides public medical care that includes dialysis and transplantation. This was in Abu Dhabi, which has, as does many parts of the Middle East and especially the UAE, relatively high rates of renal disease, as does the United States, but they're for different reasons, right? So although we're not entirely sure, the idea is that possibly the heat and the frequency of outdoor work in some of these countries leads to frequent dehydration and contributes to higher rates of end-stage renal disease. In the United States, we have, like, the reality is just we have a lot of overweight people and people with diabetes, and we also have a lot of end-stage renal disease here, and many other countries do as well. But the problem, right, is that the resident population there is only 10 million. So despite having good hospitals, right, good kidney exchange, public health care, with a population of only 10 million, you run into the same problem that I just showed you, right, with Denmark, which is a very small donor pool. And so in the summer of 2021, a three-way exchange was developed with three pairs involving a highly sensitized mother. And the first thing you should know is that frequently when we're talking about a highly sensitized patient, it is a mother, because frequently women during gestation and childbirth develop antibodies to the DNA of their spouse or parent, right? Their co-parent, and therefore of their children, right? So they are very highly sensitized, right? They've developed antibodies to that genetic material. It also means that their family members typically will not be compatible with them, right? And so they have to seek a match from outside. And so that's exactly what happened here. There was a mother-daughter pair in Abu Dhabi. In Israel, there were two pairs. There was a husband-wife pair, for one Arab-Israeli pair and a mother-daughter pair, I believe a Jewish-Israeli pair. And what happened was that the daughter from the UAE donated to the wife in the first Israeli pair. The husband of that pair then donated to the mother of this Israeli pair. And then the daughter in that Israeli pair donated back to the mother in the original UAE pair, right? So a three-way exchange, fairly simple as far as exchanges go, because sometimes we've seen exchanges with, 50 or 60 pairs. But this nonetheless was a big deal for this region and these demographics to engage in this level of cooperation, and was a really good thing, right? So as I said, there are a number of examples within Europe, I have a whole list of them in our paper, but the important thing for our purposes is that these examples are really one-offs. They're not regular operations. They're really few and far between. And rather than sort of only relying on this as a last resort, WHO and the international community, rather than encouraging self-sufficiency, should be encouraging this type of cooperation from the start. It should be encouraging it in wealthy countries with small populations who can benefit from it. It should be encouraging it in poor countries as well, who may benefit as well. We're primarily focused on the self-sufficiency prong when it comes to organs. I will talk about remuneration. It is a much more difficult hurdle, I think, right? It's a much more difficult problem to solve in the organ context than in the blood context, especially in plasma, where we're already using paid plasma for almost all of our medicinal purposes. Here, that's not the case. Only Iran has a legalized organ market. So there is very much agreement on sort of the fact that we should not have organ markets. I mean, there are specific naysayers within that, but there is still disagreement about what counts as remuneration, right? So I guess what I would say is that most countries subscribe to the notion that there should be no remuneration, Iran being the exception, but disagree about what counts as remuneration. And the reason for that there are legal differences, there are cultural differences, and there are some practical differences. But what we find especially unproductive here is that the discourse is often alarmist and really unhelpful. Almost any attempt to incentivize organ donation or to make technological progress in transplantation introduces new ethical issues that need to be solved. But not every attempt to incentivize organ donation is organ trafficking. And we need to encourage respectful discussion. We need to encourage ethical experimentation, and we need to encourage open debate. So let me give you a couple of examples here. I will start with the United States. Again, this is the law and the system that I know best, but then I'm going to shift to China in just a second. In the United States, the statute of interest is the National Organ Transplant Act, referred to as NOTA. NOTA prohibits valuable consideration. That's the term the statute uses. The statute does not define valuable consideration at all. And so there are actually a lot of questions about what counts as valuable consideration. And in some ways, we just don't know. However, we know that one thing is not valuable consideration, and that is kidney exchange. And the reason we know that is because the Norwood Act which was passed later, specifically says that kidney exchange, the trading of a kidney for a kidney, does not count as valuable consideration. Okay. Now that's the case in the United States. That is not the case in a lot of other countries, right? So Germany, Brazil, among others, don't allow kidney exchange, in part because of strict limits on donation, who you can donate to, right? And donation to strangers in particular is limited. And by definition, in kidney exchange, you're donating to a stranger, right? You're doing it for the purpose of helping someone you love, but your ultimate donation goes to a stranger. And that is constraining in a number of countries, right? So that's a difference. Financial incentives. Lots and lots of wealthy countries provide financial incentives of various sort for organ donation, but they take different forms, right? So the US, for example, tends to provide incentives in the form of tax deductions, tax credits, sick leave guarantees. Most of the tax credit, so a lot of this is at the state level. Some of the sick leave guarantees are at the federal level. Israel has probably one of the most generous programs, and it has made a huge difference in especially the rates of living organ donors. They went from one of the lowest rates to one of the higher rates. Israel grants prioritization on the deceased donor waiting list of registered donors, as well as family members of deceased donors, comprehensive financial aid, which includes 40 days of lost wage reimbursement and 7 days in a recuperation facility. So really a lot, one of the more generous programs. Some countries provide funeral benefits, but that is prohibited. So in the US, Pennsylvania once floated the idea and introduced a bill to provide funeral benefits to the families of deceased donors in order to encourage donation. But it was determined that that was prohibited by the National Organ Transplant Act and that it would have to be modified in order to permit that. Right. So you can see that there's a lot of variation, both at the legal level as well as at sort of the cultural and beliefs and ethical beliefs about what is permitted. Another example is China. As many of you, so if any of you follow organ donation, you may know that there were a lot of scandals in China. In particular, China once obtained most of its organs from executed prisoners. And in 2015, after a lot of international outcry, resolved to stop that. And I think, quite frankly, have made quite a bit of progress in doing that. Organ donation rates in China are still quite low by international standards, but considering where they started, it is actually fairly remarkable, I think, in a relatively short period of time. In part, this is because the Chinese Red Cross provides funeral benefits to, quote, recognize specific aspects of the Chinese culture. As I understand it from Chinese ethicists and surgeons that have written about this in various medical journals, the idea is to just sort of provide recognition to someone else who has been generous, right? It's showing reciprocal generosity to a family that has in turn been generous, right? And critics, especially critics in the United States and in Europe, cite WHO policies and claim that this is, quote, organ trafficking and a crime against humanity. Now, we may or may not think that providing funeral benefits is a good idea. Personally, I have no problem with it. But in any event, it's pretty hard to say that this is organ trafficking or a crime against humanity, which I want to remind you arose in the context of Nazis after World War II, right? This type of rhetoric is just not helpful, right? We can have debates about what is and is not a good idea, what's effective, what's ethical, without calling everybody that we disagree with a criminal. And that's kind of what the discourse has devolved to right now. What are our takeaways here? I'm just trying to move this so that I can see my own final slide. Trade and cooperation are good, right? Obviously, substances of human origin, including organs and blood, are special. They're not like wheat or steel or something like that. We're not going to treat them the same, but they're not so special, right? That we have decided that you can't give them. We have decided that they are valuable that we need them, that you can give them to another person, and we even incentivize that in a variety of ways. So here's what we would like to see more broadly. I've told you some of our specific recommendations, but our general recommendations are, first of all, just honesty, right? WHO and other members of the international community need to be honest about the incompatibility between non-remuneration and self-sufficiency in the plasma space. That is just absurd. Nobody who really knows anything, I think, thinks that this is going to happen. And they should just be more honest about that. Second, evidence. We should be using the latest research, not decades-old assumptions. We should experiment, right? We have lots of differences across the globe already, and we should encourage experimentation to find what is ethical and find what works and is effective, and sort of embrace, at least temporarily, the fact that different countries will have different ideas about what is the appropriate way to proceed. And then finally, debate. Everyone who disagrees with you is not a criminal. We may have different views, but the best way to ensure that even countries that are engaging in experiments that we might be uncomfortable with do it as safely as possible is to have that discussion rather than to cut off discussion and label certain countries as rogues or as not following international law or international standards. So that is my presentation. I'm going to make you larger so I can see you all.
Yes. So thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to launch the Q&A session by asking just like a simple question, which is, what was the rationale for these two WHO principles of non-remuneration self-sufficiency? What was it that really propelled them to become the standard in the field?
Yeah, this is a great question. We talk about it a little bit in the paper. I will tell you some of the rationales. They are not always specific, by the way, about the rationales, right? But I think you can glean them if you sort of look at enough stuff and follow enough of the debates. And moreover, I will say that sometimes the rationales are inconsistent, right? So if you ask, what is the self-sufficiency rationale, and you read the WHO statement on this, and you read carefully, you will see that many of those rationales actually have nothing to do with self-sufficiency. They have to do with non-remuneration. And those are two different things, right? But they're treating them as if they're the same thing. But I will say, I think probably, if we're being honest, right, the non-remuneration rationale is typically justified by concerns about safety, concerns about exploitation, and concerns about commodification. Those are probably the three most prominent ethical concerns that are raised. Concerns about self-sufficiency are almost always concerns that the wealthy countries will prey on poor countries, right? That if we allow international quote unquote cooperation, what this means is that wealthy countries will just be buying up the organs and the blood and whatever of poor countries, right? And that is something to worry about. We wouldn't want that. The irony, though, is that as you can see in the context of blood, especially plasma, right? The reality is the opposite. The wealthy countries are the ones that have plenty of that stuff and are supplying it to the rest of the world. And poor countries are just going without because they're not supplying it themselves and nobody else is providing it to them, right? And so that's one reason we start with plasma. We think that is just the easiest case. The other cases become progressively harder, but nonetheless, international cooperation is, we think, the way to go, and that rich countries have a lot that we can do to help poor countries and vice versa.
Great to hear. I'm just, as a starving PhD student, like I now know how to pay my tuition next year. Goodbye, plasma.
I'm not going to lie. I have a number of students that are plasma donors. Yeah.
Incredible. Simon, if you want to ask a question.
Yeah. And, I think it's a very, very fascinating presentation. Especially I think I resonate a lot about like the point, like the last point of everyone who disagrees with you is not a criminal. I think from a sort of Chinese cultural point of view, if I wanted to convince my aunties or uncles that,
Mhm.
about organ donation and about the cycle that I can create and all of those. It's going to take a lot of my energy to do that. So so I'm curious about maybe a little bit more on sort of the conflicts that comes with the different cultural background and
Mhm.
how that has prevented sort of the organ exchange and all of the related issue in your research.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually didn't even mention religious differences, but that plays a role as well,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there are religious differences, there are cultural differences, and there are legal differences, right? So I almost don't know where to start. There's so much. So I think the first thing is that many countries are very cautious about donation to strangers, right? So not all countries are even on board with kidney exchange itself yet, right? Now, in some country, and that arises, I think, from different places in different countries. This is a cultural difference. It brings you to the same place. But so for many countries, and I think that China historically has been one, although maybe they have changed that recently, but many of my students in the past have told me. So a number of countries are worried about trafficking, right? And one way, the simplest way to combat that is to try to restrict who can donate to who. And by requiring some sort of close family relationship, you can minimize the incidence of trafficking. This does not always work. There have been a number of cases, for example, in India, where they were family members, but were they really close? It's your uncle. There, the allegation is that money did in fact change hands. So it's not foolproof, but that is the reason that a number of countries have those types of restrictions. Germany, I think, comes at it from a different place, and maybe Brazil does as well. But in Germany, is just, they have proceeded very cautiously. After the Nazi experimentation, right? Germany has been very cautious about anything having to do with scientific advancement, experimentation, bioethics, all of it, right? They're very slow to move on this, and are very I have a lot of co-authors and friends who are like, I don't understand, in Germany, right? Who are like, I do not understand why we continue to stick to this. And other ethicists who very strongly argue that, this is an important part of German culture and it shouldn't be abandoned so quickly. And that Germany should, they should proceed cautiously. They have learned lessons from not proceeding cautiously before and don't want to take any chance of redoing those mistakes. So even just kidney exchange itself is one difference. I also think that sort of what looks like payment in one country looks like a reciprocal thank you in another country, right? And this is, I think, part of what's going on in China, right? I mean, it's a little hard to follow some of the back and forth discussion. A lot of it's not published. Sometimes it just takes place at international conferences and the like, right? But generally, it takes the form of, look, we're not taking prisoners' organs anymore. You should give us some credit. Right? And one reason that we've been able to be successful is by telling people you're doing something important. You're being generous, and we are reciprocating in that generosity. You have given us something, we are giving you something. There are other countries. So I don't know if we have anybody from Spain here. I believe that Spain and Portugal have very successful programs, and they do a variety of things, and including, I'm pretty sure in Spain, various types of assistance with burial and funeral assistance, and other things. And so, also another hurdle, different countries have different healthcare systems, right? Some countries have publicly provided healthcare. Many countries, including the United States, do not. Ironically, one of the things that is fully provided here is transplantation and dialysis. It's one of the few things that you are entitled to here. But expanding it, so because it is one of our few entitlements, anything that might cost money is a non-starter here in the United States, unless you're gonna demonstrate that it saves money, you're not going to get anything, because there are so many other things that we're not funding. And this is one of the few that we are funding. And it's very expensive because we have so many people with end-stage renal disease here.
And maybe following up on that a little bit on the methodology part. So when
Yeah.
in your experience, when you're thinking about maybe something maybe broader than the United States, like China, Spain, and Germany, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's just so complex, right? There are a
Yeah.
lot of things going on. How do you filter out what is relevant and what is not, and to really understand like what is the driving force of maybe the root cause of the issue?
Yeah, so we often joke that transplant surgeons now have to be diplomats as well. And it's kind of true, right? So I think one of the most important things, at least speaking from my own experience, and the experience of me and my co-authors, whoops, there, my lights went out. It seems to think I'm too still. It keeps shutting off. One of the most important things are personal relationships, right? And so I think having relationships with other transplant surgeons, transplant centers, and then sort of ministers, right? It's going to be different in every country, but whoever has legal jurisdiction, right, in each country is extraordinarily important. And so continuing, that's one reason why we want the discourse to be different. We need to be building these relationships and maintaining them, not ostracizing people, even if we disagree with them. I mean, it's one thing for people who are truly, we also, it's just like crying wolf too often, right? If you throw around the phrase organ trafficking, then you're losing sight of the real organ trafficking, which does in fact still happen, right? And there's just no comparison between providing funeral benefits for somebody, or trying to fund kidney exchange through a variety of methods, and trafficking across borders or even domestically, in sort of black markets. There's just no comparison, and it's really not helpful, we think, to conflate them in this way.
I see. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Marilyn, I think
Oh, she
she's
looks
frozen.
frozen.
Yeah, she's
I thought she was just looking intently, but I actually think she's frozen. Oh, there she is.
Okay, she's back.
Oh my
She's
God, I
fine.
don't know what happened. You must have said some dark word and the Matrix took me away. So sorry, were you able to, were you done answering Simon's question?
I am done with Simon's question. Yes.
Awesome, amazing. Yeah, well, since we're coming down to our last few minutes, I really want to take advantage of your presence as much as I could.
Yeah.
We have an audience of young international scholars, and you're at the forefront of such an interesting field. Like it is so interdisciplinary, and on top of that, you deal with taboos and all the complexities that come with that. So I kind of was a little bit curious, when you were saying, well, people were like in the area were like launching compliments, insults at each other, like saying war crimes and stuff like that. I kind of, if you felt like sharing, what was kind of the worst backlash you ever had, and how can you cope with it when you navigate a difficult field?
Yeah. I guess the first thing is to try to remain calm, right? If they go low, you go high, I guess. And I am in some ways, because I'm a legal academic, right? Not subject to the same constraints, perhaps, that some of my collaborators who are in medicine or even in economics. Well, economists, they don't care that much. They yell, they do whatever. But I think it gives some of us outside a little more freedom, right? To push controversial ideas, because it doesn't matter whether we're not sort of we're not part of the insiders group anyway, right? And so it does give us a little bit more freedom. But I do think that part of it is, Marilyn, what you began your introduction with today, right? Which is stay focused on the science. There's a lot of research here, right? Much of which is being completely ignored by the international community in favor of some talking points that are easy and that are simple and that make people feel good, but that don't result in more people getting blood or plasma or organs that need them. And so I think that if you just take seriously the notion that we need to our policies on these things need to be informed by evidence and not by just assumptions or just sort of feels. It doesn't mean that we're not interested in ethics, right? We are, right? I mean, I want to emphasize that that is important, but it does mean that rather than going around just sort of talking about like safety concerns, look at the data, right? And think about ways like we've made a lot of progress in market design, regulatory structure, sort of international cooperation with other countries in other areas, all of these things that we can build on to sort of make the world a better place when it comes to human materials. And we need to do that and stop treating like it's so special. It is special, but not that special.
I really think we can extrapolate that academic advice to today's political discourse.
Yes, exactly. We can try to remember that.
Exactly. Okay, and if it's okay with you as we're wrapping up, could we take a screenshot just to commemorate today's
Yeah,
presentation? That'd be
absolutely.
fine.
Yeah.
And if you could just stop sharing your screen so we can see it's just like the same
yeah.
button that you press to share. Exactly, perfect.
Okay.
Simon, do you want to go ahead and take a screenshot?
Yes, let's
And if
do
our
it.
participants could turn on their video, we would be
Yeah, that would be
eternally
nice.
grateful.
All right. All right, let's do it. 1, 2, 3. Let's take another one. If David is able to turn on his camera. 1, 2, 3. All right, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Krawiec. And thank you all for tuning in today.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.